In a world where split-second decisions can make or break careers, where honor meets reality, and where tradition clashes with modern law enforcement, one moment can define a lifetime of service. What happens when an elite royal guard, trained to protect the highest levels of society, finds himself on the wrong end of SWAT team's taser? What happens when years of discipline, respect, and unwavering loyalty are tested in the most unexpected way? This isn't just another story about police encounters or military protocol. This is about a man whose response to injustice became a masterclass in character, whose reaction under extreme stress revealed the true meaning of honor, and whose impeccable discipline turned what could have been a career-ending incident into a defining moment that would inspire thousands. When Officer Michael Harrison stepped out of his vehicle that cold Tuesday morning, he had no idea that the next few minutes would test everything he had learned in 15 years of protecting royalty. He had no idea that his reaction would be recorded, shared worldwide, and studied in police academies as an example of extraordinary professionalism under pressure. This is the story of a man who proved that true strength isn't about fighting back. It's about knowing when not to. Michael Harrison had always believed that respect was something you earned through years of consistent behavior, not something that came with a uniform. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, with the kind of posture that spoke of military training, Michael represented everything that people expected from a royal guard. His shoulders were always squared, his uniform always pressed to perfection, and his demeanor always calm and professional. For 15 years, he had served the royal family with unwavering dedication, earning commendations for his service and the deep respect of his colleagues. The morning of Tuesday, March 15th, started like any other for Michael. He woke at 5:30 in the morning, as he had every day for the past decade and a half. His routine was precise and deliberate. A quick shower, a breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, and 30 minutes reviewing the day's security protocols. By 7 o'clock, he was dressed in his Royal Guard uniform, the deep blue fabric bearing the insignia that marked him as one of the elite few trusted to protect the monarchy. Michael's apartment reflected the same discipline that governed his professional life. Everything had its place, from the perfectly aligned shoes at the entrance to the military-style bed that looked like it could pass inspection at any moment. On the wall hung his certificates of achievement, photographs with various members of the royal family, and a single framed quote that had guided his career. Discipline is the bridge between goals and accomplishment. As he prepared to leave for work that morning, Michael reviewed the day's schedule on his secure communication device. The royal family had a busy day ahead, with multiple public engagements that would require careful coordination between various security teams. Michael's role was to provide close protection during a charity event at the city's main hospital, where the princess would be visiting children in the cancer ward. It was the kind of assignment that Michael particularly enjoyed, seeing the genuine joy that royal visits brought to sick children and their families. The drive to the palace took Michael through some of the city's most historic neighborhoods. He had made this journey thousands of times, but he never tired of seeing the ancient buildings and tree-lined streets that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. There is something deeply satisfying about being part of an institution that connected the present to such a rich history. As he drove, Michael mentally reviewed the security protocols for the hospital visit, thinking through potential challenges and escape routes as had become second nature to him. At the palace, Michael's day began with the morning briefing. The security team gathered in a windowless room deep within the building, where they reviewed intelligence reports, discussed potential threats, and coordinated their efforts for the day ahead. Michael sat quietly during these meetings, listening intently and taking detailed notes. His colleagues knew they could count on him to spot details that others might miss and to remain calm under pressure. The team leader, Commander Sarah Thompson, had worked with Michael for 8 years and trusted his judgment completely. She often assigned him to the most challenging details because she knew he would handle any situation with the professionalism that their position demanded. "Harrison," she said as the briefing concluded, "you'll take point on the hospital visit. I want you personally overseeing the princess's security throughout the event." Michael nodded, understanding the weight of the responsibility. Protecting a member of the royal family in a public setting required constant vigilance and the ability to make split-second decisions that could have far-reaching consequences. He spent the next 2 hours reviewing the hospital's floor plans, studying the route the princess would take, and coordinating with local law enforcement to ensure that every aspect of the visit would go smoothly. The hospital visit began without incident. The princess moved through the cancer ward with the grace and compassion that had made her beloved by the public. She spent time with each child, listening to their stories, and bringing smiles to faces that had seen too much sadness for their young years. Michael maintained a discreet distance, close enough to respond to any threat, but far enough away to allow the princess to connect naturally with the children and their families. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Michael felt the satisfaction that came from a job well done. The visit had exceeded everyone's expectations, with beautiful moments captured by photographers that would lift spirits around the world. The security had been seamless, with no incidents or concerns. As they walked toward the exit, Michael was already thinking ahead to the afternoon schedule and the logistical challenges it would present. It was then that everything changed in a way that no amount of training could have prepared him for. As they reached the hospital's main entrance, Michael noticed an unusual amount of activity in the parking area. Several unmarked vehicles had arrived, and he could see officers in tactical gear positioning themselves around the perimeter. His training kicked in immediately, and he began assessing potential threats while maintaining his position near the princess. What Michael didn't know was that a completely unrelated incident had unfolded just blocks away. A robbery suspect had fled the scene of a crime and was believed to be heading toward the hospital area. Multiple law enforcement agencies had responded, including a SWAT team that was working to establish a perimeter and locate the suspect. In the confusion of the moment, with multiple security personnel from different agencies operating in the same space, a perfect storm of miscommunication was beginning to brew. As Michael helped coordinate the princess's departure, ensuring that her vehicle was properly secured and that the route to their next destination was clear, he noticed one of the tactical officers approaching him with what seemed like unusual urgency. The officer was young, probably early 30s, with the intense focus that came from training and adrenaline. Michael assumed the officer wanted to coordinate security efforts, as often happened when multiple agencies were operating in the same area. Michael turned toward the approaching officer with his usual professional demeanor, ready to provide whatever assistance or information might be needed. His hands were visible, his posture non-threatening, and his expression calm and cooperative. He had interacted with law enforcement officers countless times throughout his career, and these encounters had always been marked by mutual respect and professional courtesy. The SWAT officer, however, seemed to be operating under different assumptions. Later investigation would reveal that in the chaos of the rapidly developing situation, communication breakdowns had occurred between various agencies. The officer had been given incomplete information about personnel in the area and had been told to detain anyone who didn't immediately identify themselves as law enforcement. As Michael began to speak, identifying himself as royal security and offering to show his credentials, the situation escalated with shocking speed. The SWAT officer, perhaps misinterpreting Michael's movement toward his identification as a potential threat, made a decision that would have consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined in that moment. Michael felt the electric shock course through his body as the taser struck him in the chest. The sensation was unlike anything he had experienced, even during his military training exercises. His muscles contracted involuntarily, and he fell to the ground, his body convulsing from the electrical current. For several seconds, he was completely helpless, unable to speak or move as the electricity overwhelmed his nervous system. As the shock subsided and Michael's vision cleared, he found himself surrounded by tactical officers, some with weapons drawn, others speaking rapidly into their radio communications. The princess had been quickly moved to safety by other members of the security team, but Michael could see the confusion and concern on the faces of everyone present. It was in this moment, lying on the ground with his dignity stripped away and his professional reputation potentially in ruins, that Michael would demonstrate the kind of character that defines true leadership. What happened next would be talked about in law enforcement circles for years to come, studied in training academies, and shared as an example of extraordinary professionalism under the most challenging circumstances. Michael's response in those crucial moments would reveal why he had earned the trust and respect of everyone he worked with over his 15-year career. It would demonstrate that true discipline isn't about following rules when it's easy, but about maintaining your principles when everything seems to be falling apart around you. As he slowly got to his feet, with officers still uncertain about the situation and tensions running high, Michael would prove that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is not anger or retaliation, but a demonstration of the very qualities that make someone worthy of trust in the first place. The seconds immediately following the Taser incident felt like hours to everyone present. Michael Harrison lay on the cold concrete outside the hospital, his body still recovering from the electrical shock that had rendered him helpless moments before. Around him, the chaos of the situation continued to unfold as officers tried to piece together what had just happened and why a man in Royal Guard uniform had been treated as a potential threat. As feeling returned to his limbs, Michael's first instinct was not anger or confusion, but concern for the safety of the princess he had been assigned to protect. Even while struggling to regain his composure, his eyes searched the area to ensure that she had been safely removed from what was clearly a volatile situation. The training that had been drilled into him over 15 years was so deeply ingrained that even in his own moment of crisis, his primary concern remained the well-being of those under his protection. Officer James Mitchell, the SWAT team member who had deployed the Taser, stood over Michael with his weapon still drawn, uncertainty written across his face. Mitchell was a 7-year veteran of the force with a previously spotless record, but in the confusion of the rapidly developing situation, he had made a decision based on incomplete information that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The communication breakdown that had led to this moment was the result of multiple factors: different radio frequencies between agencies, unclear chain of command in a multi-jurisdictional operation, and the pressure of tracking a dangerous suspect in a crowded public area. As Michael slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position, the first words that came out of his mouth would later be described by witnesses as remarkable for their calm professionalism. Instead of demanding explanations or expressing outrage at his treatment, Michael looked directly at Officer Mitchell and said, "I understand you were doing your job. My name is Michael Harrison, Royal Guard Service, badge number 4478. I can provide identification if you need to verify my credentials." The simplicity and dignity of Michael's response caught everyone off guard. Here was a man who had just been subjected to what amounted to an assault, yet his first instinct was to de-escalate the situation and provide the information that would help resolve the confusion. The other officers present, both Royal Security personnel and local law enforcement, watched in amazement as Michael demonstrated a level of professionalism that went far beyond what anyone expected under such circumstances. Officer Mitchell lowered his weapon, the reality of what had just occurred beginning to sink in. He had just used a taser on a member of the Royal Security detail, a man whose credentials and reputation were beyond reproach. The implications of this mistake were staggering, not just for his own career, but for the relationships between different law enforcement agencies that depended on trust and mutual respect. Commander Sarah Thompson arrived on the scene within minutes of being alerted to the incident. Her 15 years of experience managing security operations had taught her to expect the unexpected, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of one of her most trusted officers sitting on the ground after being tossed by a fellow law enforcement professional. Her first priority was ensuring Michael's physical well-being, but she was also acutely aware that this incident had the potential to create a diplomatic crisis if not handled with extraordinary care. "Are you injured, Michael?" she asked as she knelt beside him, her voice carrying both professional concern and personal worry for a colleague she had come to regard as a friend over their years of working together. Michael shook his head, testing his coordination as he prepared to stand. The effects of the taser were wearing off, but he could feel soreness in his muscles where they had contracted violently under the electrical current. As Michael got to his feet with Commander Thompson's assistance, the crowd of officers that had gathered began to understand the magnitude of what had just transpired. Word of the incident was already spreading through radio communications, reaching supervisors and administrators who would need to manage the fallout from this unprecedented situation. The fact that a Royal Guard had been tossed during a security operation was not just a local law enforcement issue. It had implications that reached the highest levels of government. Michael's next actions would prove even more remarkable than his initial response. As he brushed dirt from his uniform and straightened his posture, he approached Officer Mitchell with an expression of understanding rather than anger. The young SWAT officer looked stricken, clearly realizing that his career might be over because of a split-second decision made under pressure. "Officer Mitchell," Michael said, reading the name tag on the man's tactical vest, "I want you to know that I understand the position you were in. Communication breakdowns happen, and you were operating with the information you had available. I hold no personal grudge against you for doing what you thought was necessary to protect public safety." The grace and maturity of Michael's words left Officer Mitchell nearly speechless. He had expected anger, demands for disciplinary action, or at minimum a formal complaint that would end his law enforcement career. Instead, he was being offered understanding and forgiveness by the very man he had wronged. Tears formed in Mitchell's eyes as he struggled to respond to kindness he felt he didn't deserve. The incident report that would be filed later that day would capture the basic facts of what occurred, but it could never fully convey the human drama that unfolded in those moments after the taser was deployed. Multiple witnesses would later describe Michael's response as one of the most professional and dignified reactions they had ever observed under such circumstances. His ability to separate the person from the action, to understand the pressures that led to the mistake while still maintaining his own dignity, impressed even seasoned law enforcement veterans who thought they had seen everything. Commander Thompson worked quickly to manage the immediate aftermath of the incident. The princess had been safely transported to her next engagement, with other team members ensuring that the day's schedule could continue without further disruption. The robbery suspect who had originally prompted the SWAT response was apprehended several blocks away, bringing closure to the operation that had created the chaos in the first place. But the real focus now was on addressing what had happened to Michael and ensuring that lessons were learned to prevent similar incidents in the future. As news of the incident began to reach higher levels of both organizations, Michael found himself at the center of attention he neither wanted nor sought. Phone calls were made between agency heads. Meetings were scheduled to review protocols, and lawyers began examining the legal implications of what had occurred. Throughout all of this activity, Michael maintained the same calm professionalism that had marked his entire career, cooperating fully with investigators while continuing to express understanding for the difficult position Officer Mitchell had been in. The hospital staff who had witnessed the incident were equally impressed by Michael's response. Several nurses and doctors approached him to express their admiration for the way he had handled such a difficult situation. One elderly doctor, who had served in the military decades earlier, told Michael that his reaction reminded him of the best officers he had known during his service, men who understood that true strength was demonstrated through restraint and dignity rather than retaliation. As the immediate crisis was managed and the various agencies began their formal review processes, Michael returned to his duties with characteristic dedication. He completed his shift, ensuring that all security protocols were followed for the remaining royal engagements of the day. His colleagues watched him with new respect, amazed that he could continue functioning at his usual high level after experiencing such a traumatic and humiliating incident. That evening, as Michael returned to his apartment and finally had a moment to process what had happened, the full impact of the day's events began to settle in. He had been assaulted by a fellow law enforcement officer, subjected to a level of force that was completely unwarranted, and humiliated in front of colleagues and civilians alike. Yet his response had been one of understanding and professionalism that had impressed everyone who witnessed it. As he prepared for bed, Michael reflected on the principles that had guided his response. His military training had taught him that discipline was not about following orders when it was easy, but about maintaining your standards when everything around you is chaos. His years of royal service had reinforced the importance of dignity under pressure, of representing something larger than yourself, even in the most difficult circumstances. The incident would be investigated thoroughly, protocols would be reviewed and improved, and measures would be put in place to prevent similar communication breakdowns in the future. But the lasting impact of that day would not be the mistakes that were made, but rather the example of character and professionalism that Michael Harrison demonstrated in his response to those mistakes. The investigation into the Taser incident began within hours of its occurrence, led by a joint committee representing both the Royal Security Service and the local law enforcement agency. Detective Inspector Margaret Wells, a 23-year veteran with a reputation for thorough and impartial investigations, was appointed to head the inquiry. Her first priority was to interview all witnesses and gather video evidence from the multiple security cameras that had captured various angles of the incident. Michael Harrison's interview took place 2 days after the incident in a sterile conference room at police headquarters. Despite offers from his union representative to delay the interview until he had more time to recover from the trauma, Michael insisted on proceeding immediately. He arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a fresh uniform, and carrying a detailed written account of the events that he had prepared the previous evening. Detective Inspector Wells had reviewed hundreds of officer-involved incidents throughout her career, but she had never encountered someone quite like Michael Harrison. Most individuals who had been subjected to the use of force by law enforcement arrived at their interviews with lawyers, attitudes, and demand for justice. Michael arrived with cooperation, professionalism, and a genuine desire to help improve the system that had failed him. I want to begin by stating that I understand the difficult position Officer Mitchell was in, Michael said as the interview began, his voice steady and clear. I've reviewed my own actions that morning, and while I believe I followed all proper protocols, I recognize that in a dynamic situation with multiple agencies involved, confusion can occur. My primary goal is to help ensure that future incidents like this are prevented. Wells had to pause the recording to make sure she had heard correctly. In her experience, victims of police misconduct typically began interviews with demands for accountability and descriptions of their emotional trauma. Michael Harrison was beginning his interview by expressing sympathy for the officer who had wronged him and offering to help improve training procedures. As the interview progressed, Michael provided a minute-by-minute account of the morning's events, from his arrival at the hospital through the moment he was tossed. His recollection was remarkably detailed and precise, aided by the notes he had made immediately after the incident while the events were still fresh in his memory. He identified several points where better communication might have prevented the confusion that led to his being mistaken for a threat. At approximately 11:47 a.m., I noticed the tactical team vehicles arriving in the hospital parking area, Michael explained, referring to his notes. Given that we had not been notified of any law enforcement operation in the area, I should have immediately contacted our command center to verify the situation. This might have prevented the communication breakdown that led to the confusion about my identity and role. Detective Inspector Wells found herself taking notes not just on the facts of the incident, but on Michael's approach to analyzing what had gone wrong. His ability to identify potential improvements without assigning blame was the kind of thinking that investigators hope to see from law enforcement professionals, but rarely encountered from individuals who had been wronged by the system. The video evidence from hospital security cameras told a compelling story that supported Michael's account in every detail. The footage showed him moving slowly and deliberately, his hands clearly visible, his body language non-threatening throughout the encounter. When Officer Mitchell approached him, the video clearly showed Michael turning toward him with an open posture, beginning to reach for his identification before being struck by the taser. Perhaps most remarkably, the video captured Michael's immediate response after being shocked. As he struggled to regain his footing, His first visible action was to look around for the princess he had been protecting, ensuring her safety even while dealing with his own crisis. The footage then showed him speaking calmly to Officer Mitchell, his body language remaining non-aggressive despite having just been subjected to what amounted to an unprovoked attack. Officer Mitchell's interview presented a stark contrast to Michael's composed testimony. The young SWAT officer was clearly devastated by his mistake, struggling to explain the series of assumptions and miscommunications that had led to his decision to deploy the taser. He had received incomplete information about personnel in the area, had been operating under extreme time pressure, and had made a split-second decision based on what he later realized was insufficient information. "I know I destroyed my career with that decision," Mitchell said during his interview, his voice barely above a whisper. But what makes it worse is how Mr. Harrison responded. "He showed me more kindness and understanding than I showed him. I've been in law enforcement for 7 years, and I thought I understood what professionalism looked like. Then I met him, and I realized I had never seen it demonstrated at that level." The investigation expanded to examine the broader systemic issues that had contributed to the incident. Communication protocols between different agencies were reviewed and found to be inadequate for complex operations involving multiple jurisdictions. Training procedures were examined to determine how better to prepare officers for situations where they might encounter security personnel from other agencies. Equipment and identification standards were analyzed to see how law enforcement professionals could more easily identify each other in high-stress situations. Meanwhile, word of Michael's remarkable response to the incident began to spread throughout law enforcement circles. Commander Thompson had shared the story with her counterparts in other agencies, who passed it along to their own personnel. Within a week, Michael was receiving phone calls and emails from officers around the country who had heard about his professionalism and wanted to express their admiration for his character. The royal family themselves learned of the incident through official channels, and their response was swift and unequivocal. A formal letter of commendation was prepared, recognizing Michael's extraordinary professionalism under difficult circumstances. The letter, signed by senior members of the royal household, would become one of Michael's most treasured possessions, not because of its official nature, but because of what it represented about the values he had tried to uphold throughout his career. Media attention to the story was initially limited, as both agencies worked to keep details of the investigation confidential until it was completed. However, hospital staff who had witnessed the incident began sharing their accounts with friends and family, and soon the story of the Royal Guard who had responded to injustice with grace and dignity was spreading through social media and local news outlets. A video clip recorded by a hospital visitor on their cell phone captured the moment when Michael helped Officer Mitchell to his feet after the young officer had broken down in tears while apologizing for his mistake. The 30-second clip, showing Michael's hand on Mitchell's shoulder as he offered words of encouragement and support, went viral within days of being posted online. The response from the public was overwhelmingly positive. Comments poured in from around the world, with people expressing admiration for Michael's character and using his response as an example of how conflicts should be handled. Law enforcement training academies began incorporating the incident into their curricula as an example of exceptional professionalism under pressure. Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychologist who specialized in crisis response and law enforcement stress, was brought in to evaluate the incident as part of the investigation. Her report noted that Michael's response demonstrated several characteristics that were extremely rare in high-stress situations: the ability to separate personal emotion from professional responsibility, the capacity to maintain empathy for others even while being wronged, and the strength to respond to conflict with grace rather than retaliation. In 30 years of studying human behavior under stress, Dr. Foster wrote in her report, "I have rarely encountered an individual who demonstrated such remarkable emotional intelligence and professional maturity under circumstances that would justify anger and demands for retribution." Mr. Harrison's response represents the highest ideals of law enforcement professionalism. As the investigation neared its conclusion, both agencies began implementing changes designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. New communication protocols were established for multi-jurisdictional operations. Additional training was mandated for situations involving personnel from different agencies, and improved identification procedures were developed to help officers quickly recognize colleagues from other organizations. Officer Mitchell requested a meeting with Michael before the investigation's findings were officially released. The meeting took place in Commander Thompson's office, with both men's supervisors present to ensure that proper protocols were followed. Mitchell had prepared a formal apology that he had worked on for days, but when he saw Michael, the words he had rehearsed seemed inadequate. "I don't know how to apologize for what I did to you," Mitchell began, his voice shaking with emotion. "I know that saying I'm sorry doesn't undo what happened or take away the humiliation I caused you. But I want you to know that your response to my mistake has changed how I think about what it means to be a professional." Michael's response was characteristic of everything he had demonstrated throughout the entire ordeal. "Officer Mitchell," he said, "we're all human beings trying to do difficult jobs under challenging circumstances. You made a mistake, but you made it while trying to protect the public. I respect that intention, even though I wish the outcome had been different. What matters now is that we all learn from what happened and work to make sure it doesn't happen again." The grace and wisdom of Michael's words left everyone in the room with a deeper understanding of what true leadership looked like. Here was a man who had every right to demand justice, to seek retribution, or at minimum to express anger at his mistreatment. Instead, he was offering forgiveness, understanding, and hope for the future. The formal investigation concluded 6 weeks after the incident, with a comprehensive report that would become a case study in law enforcement training programs across the country. The findings were clear and unambiguous. Officer Mitchell had made a serious error in judgment that resulted from inadequate communication protocols and insufficient training for multi-jurisdictional operations. However, the report's most significant sections focused not on the mistake itself, but on Michael Harrison's extraordinary response and what it revealed about true professionalism. Chief Inspector Robert Davies, who oversaw both the investigation and the implementation of new policies, called Michael's behavior a masterclass in grace under pressure. The report noted that Michael's immediate concern for public safety, his calm cooperation with the investigation, and his continued support for improving the system demonstrated leadership qualities that went far beyond his official rank and responsibilities. The recommendations that emerged from the investigation were comprehensive and far-reaching. New communication protocols required all agencies involved in multi-jurisdictional operations to establish clear channels for identifying personnel from different organizations. Enhanced training programs were developed to help officers recognize and interact appropriately with security personnel from other agencies. Perhaps most importantly, the incident became the foundation for new conflict resolution training that emphasized de-escalation and professional courtesy in high-stress situations. Michael found himself unexpectedly thrust into a role as an expert consultant on these new training programs. Law enforcement academies and professional organizations began inviting him to speak about his experience and the principles that had guided his response. Initially reluctant to accept these speaking engagements, Michael eventually agreed when he realized that sharing his story could help prevent similar incidents and improve relationships between different law enforcement agencies. His first speaking engagement was at the National Law Enforcement Training Conference, where he addressed an audience of over 500 officers, supervisors, and training coordinators. Standing at the podium in his dress uniform, Michael spoke without notes, drawing on 15 years of experience and the wisdom gained from one of the most challenging moments of his career. "The question I'm asked most often," Michael told the audience, "is how I was able to remain calm and professional after being tossed by a fellow officer. The answer is that my response wasn't about that particular moment. It was about the values and principles I had been developing throughout my entire career. When we truly internalize the ideals of service and professionalism, our responses in crisis situations become automatic." The speech was met with a standing ovation, and led to dozens of additional speaking requests from organizations across the country. Michael's message resonated particularly strongly with young officers who were still forming their professional identities and with experienced supervisors who recognized the importance of leading by example. Officer Mitchell, meanwhile, was facing the consequences of his actions through the formal disciplinary process. While the investigation had found that he acted without malice and under difficult circumstances, the fact remained that he had used force against an innocent colleague without proper justification. Department policy required disciplinary action, and Mitchell faced the possibility of suspension or even termination. However, Michael's continued advocacy for understanding and forgiveness had an unexpected impact on the disciplinary proceedings. In a letter to the department's leadership, Michael wrote, "Officer Mitchell made a mistake, but punishing him severely would serve no useful purpose and would only harm a dedicated officer who has learned valuable lessons from this experience. I urge you to consider disciplinary measures that focus on additional training and professional development rather than punishment that could end his career." The letter carried significant weight because it came from the victim of Mitchell's mistake. Department leadership ultimately decided on a course of corrective action that included additional training, a formal reprimand, and assignment to work with Michael on developing new protocols for interagency cooperation. The decision was controversial within law enforcement circles, with some arguing that more severe punishment was warranted and others praising the focus on rehabilitation over retribution. The partnership between Michael and Mitchell in developing new training protocols proved to be one of the most valuable outcomes of the entire incident. Working together, they created realistic scenarios that helped officers understand the challenges of identifying personnel from different agencies and the importance of verification before taking action. Their collaboration demonstrated that even serious professional conflicts could be resolved constructively when both parties committed to learning and improvement. The media attention surrounding the story continued to grow, with national news outlets picking up the story of the Royal Guard who had responded to injustice with extraordinary grace. Interview requests poured in from television programs, newspapers, and magazines, all wanting to understand what motivated such an unusual response to what many would consider an outrageous violation of trust and dignity. Michael accepted a limited number of these media interviews, always focusing on the broader lessons rather than the personal details of his experience. His message remained consistent across all platforms. True professionalism meant maintaining your values and principles even when others failed to live up to theirs, and the best response to conflict was understanding and cooperation rather than anger and retaliation. One television interview in particular captured public attention when the host asked Michael whether he ever felt angry about what had happened to him. Michael's response became one of the most quoted statements to emerge from the entire incident. Anger would have accomplished nothing positive. It wouldn't have undone what happened. It wouldn't have improved the system, and it wouldn't have helped Officer Mitchell learn from his mistake. My goal was never to punish anyone. It was to help ensure that future officers and the public they serve would benefit from what we learned. The philosophical depth of Michael's approach to the incident began attracting attention from academic researchers who studied conflict resolution and organizational behavior. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a professor of organizational psychology at the State University, reached out to Michael to request permission to study his response as part of her research on leadership under stress. What makes Mr. Harrison's response so remarkable, Dr. Martinez explained in her subsequent research paper, is not just that he remained calm under pressure, but that he immediately began focusing on systemic improvements rather than personal grievances. This represents a level of emotional maturity and systems thinking that is extremely rare in high-stress situations. The royal family's response to the incident and its aftermath was equally remarkable. Rather than expressing outrage at the treatment of one of their protectors, they used the incident as an opportunity to highlight the professionalism and dedication of their entire security team. A formal reception was held at the palace to honor Michael and his colleagues, with senior royals personally thanking him for his service and his exemplary response to a difficult situation. During the reception, the princess whom Michael had been protecting during the hospital visit made a point of speaking with him personally. "What happened to you that day was wrong," she told him, "but your response reminded all of us what true dignity looks like. You represented not just yourself and our security service, but the very best of what public service can be." The incident also led to improvements in the Royal Security Service's own protocols and training programs. Michael was asked to lead a comprehensive review of procedures for interactions with other law enforcement agencies, drawing on his experience to identify potential areas of confusion or conflict. His recommendations resulted in enhanced coordination procedures and regular joint training exercises with local police departments. As the one-year anniversary of the incident approached, both organizations involved planned commemorative events to mark the lessons learned and improvements implemented. The local police department announced the creation of the Michael Harrison Award for Professional Excellence, to be given annually to officers who demonstrated exceptional character and judgment under difficult circumstances. Michael was initially uncomfortable with having an award named in his honor, but he eventually agreed when he understood that it would help keep the focus on the values and principles that he believed were most important. "If this award helps even one officer remember the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect," he said, "then it will be worth any personal discomfort I might feel." The transformation of a potentially career-ending incident into a catalyst for positive change throughout the law enforcement community represented one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire story. What could have been a source of division and mistrust between agencies instead became the foundation for improved cooperation and understanding. Officer Mitchell, reflecting on a year that had passed since the incident, often spoke about how Michael's response had changed his own approach to law enforcement. "I learned more about being a professional from Mr. Harrison in the 30 minutes after I tossed him than I had learned in 7 years on the force," Mitchell told colleagues. "His example showed me that true strength comes from how you treat people, especially when you have every right to treat them badly." 5 years after the incident that had tested his character in ways he never could have imagined, Michael Harrison found himself standing before an audience of newly graduated police officers at their commissioning ceremony. As the keynote speaker for the event, he looked out at the eager faces of young men and women who were about to begin their careers in law enforcement, and he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The transformation of his role from Royal Protection Officer to leadership consultant and trainer had been gradual but profound. What had begun as reluctant participation in post-incident training programs had evolved into a passion for helping other law enforcement professionals understand the principles that he had discovered were truly important in their work. Michael had not planned to become an educator and mentor, but he had found that sharing his experience and the lessons he had learned was perhaps the most meaningful work of his career. The training programs that Michael had helped develop were now being used in police academies across the country and had been adopted by several international law enforcement organizations. The curriculum focused not just on technical skills and procedures, but on the character development and ethical foundation that Michael believed were essential for true professional excellence. Students learned about de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and, most importantly, the importance of treating every person they encountered with dignity and respect. Officer James Mitchell had become one of Michael's most effective partners in delivering these training programs. The young officer who had made such a devastating mistake 5 years earlier had transformed his error into expertise, becoming a powerful advocate for the kind of careful, thoughtful policing that could prevent similar incidents. Mitchell often told audiences that being forgiven by Michael Harrison had taught him more about justice and mercy than any textbook or training manual ever could. "When someone shows you grace when you least deserve it," Mitchell would tell new officers, "it changes something fundamental inside you. It makes you want to be worthy of that grace, not just in that moment, but in every interaction you have for the rest of your career." Mr. Harrison could have destroyed my career with a single complaint. Instead, he helped me become the kind of officer I never knew I could be. The partnership between Michael and Mitchell had become legendary in law enforcement circles, not just because of the unusual circumstances that had brought them together, but because of what their collaboration represented about the possibility of redemption and growth even after serious mistakes. Their joint presentations at training conferences were always standing room only events, with officers traveling from around the country to hear their story and learn from their experience. The research conducted by Dr. Jennifer Martinez and her colleagues have been published in multiple academic journals and had contributed to a growing understanding of leadership under stress and conflict resolution in high-pressure environments. The Harrison response, as it had come to be known in academic literature, was studied as an example of emotional intelligence and systems thinking that could be taught and developed in other professionals. Dr. Martinez had followed up with both Michael and Mitchell over the years, documenting the long-term effects of the incident and their subsequent collaboration. Her research showed that organizations that implemented training based on their experience saw significant improvements in officer conduct, reduced complaints from the public, and better relationships between different law enforcement agencies. The Royal Security Service had undergone its own transformation in the years following the incident. Michael's recommendations for improved protocols and training have been implemented not just within his own organization, but have been shared with security services around the world. The incident had become a case study in how professional organizations could learn from mistakes and turn potential disasters into opportunities for improvement. Commander Sarah Thompson, who had been promoted to Deputy Director of Royal Security, often reflected on how the incident had changed not just Michael's career, but the entire culture of their organization. "We always thought we were professional before," she told colleagues, "but watching Michael's response to that situation taught us what true professionalism really looked like. It raised the bar for all of us." The annual Michael Harrison Award for Professional Excellence had become one of the most prestigious honors in law enforcement, with recipients chosen not just for their technical competence, but for their demonstration of character, integrity, and service to others. Michael attended each award ceremony, presenting the honor to officers who exemplified the values that he believed were most important in their profession. The recipients of the award came from departments large and small, representing diverse backgrounds and experiences, but they all shared common characteristics. They treated people with dignity regardless of circumstances. They sought to build bridges rather than create divisions. And they understood that true strength came from restraint and wisdom rather than force and power. One particularly memorable recipient was Officer Maria Santos, a community policing specialist who had spent her career working in some of the city's most challenging neighborhoods. When presenting her award, Michael spoke about how her work demonstrated that the same principles that had guided his response to being tossed could be applied to everyday interactions with the public. "Officer Santos understands what I learned that day outside the hospital," Michael told the audience. "Our response to conflict and challenge defines not just who we are as individuals, but who we are as a profession. Every interaction we have is an opportunity to demonstrate the values we claim to uphold." The incident had also led to lasting changes in Michael's personal life. The experience of being thrust into the public eye and asked to share his story had helped him develop communication skills and confidence that he had never known he possessed. He had married Dr. Emily Richardson, a physician he had met during one of his speaking engagements at a medical conference, where she had been impressed by his insights into stress management and professional conduct under pressure. Their wedding was attended by colleagues from across the law enforcement community, including Officer Mitchell, who served as one of Michael's groomsmen. The presence of the man who had once been his antagonist as an honored guest at his wedding was seen by many as the perfect symbol of the forgiveness and reconciliation that had defined Michael's response from the beginning. Michael's children, now 5 and 3 years old, were growing up with stories of their father's professional experiences that emphasized the importance of treating all people with kindness and respect. He hoped that they would learn from his example that conflicts could be resolved through understanding rather than retaliation, and that true strength was demonstrated through character rather than force. As Michael concluded his remarks to the new police officers at their commissioning ceremony, He shared the lesson that he believed was most important for them to understand as they began their careers. You will face situations that test everything you believe about fairness, justice, and human dignity, he told them. In those moments, remember that your response defines not just your career, but your character. Choose grace over grievance, understanding over anger, and you'll discover that you have the power to transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone you encounter. The standing ovation that followed his remarks lasted several minutes, with many of the new officers wiping tears from their eyes as they contemplated the responsibility they were about to undertake, and the example that Michael Harrison had set for how that responsibility should be carried. After the ceremony, Michael was approached by dozens of the new officers, each wanting to thank him for his message and to ask for his advice as they began their careers. He spent hours speaking with them individually, offering encouragement and wisdom gained from nearly 2 decades of experience in law enforcement and public service. As he drove home that evening, Michael reflected on the journey that had brought him from being a victim of a serious mistake to becoming a respected voice for positive change in law enforcement. The incident that could have ended his career had instead become the foundation for work that he found deeply meaningful and rewarding. He had learned that sometimes our greatest challenges become our greatest opportunities if we have the courage to respond with wisdom rather than anger. The last 5 years had proven that his choice to respond to injustice with grace rather than grievance had consequences far beyond what he could have imagined in that moment outside the hospital. His example had influenced thousands of law enforcement officers, improved training programs across the country, and demonstrated that individuals had the power to create positive change even in the most difficult circumstances. Officer Mitchell, now a supervisor himself and a respected trainer in the same programs that Michael had helped create, often told new officers that the incident that nearly ended his career had actually saved it. Mr. Harrison showed me what real leadership looked like, he would say. Not leadership that demanded followers, but leadership that inspired them. That's the kind of officer I try to be every day, and that's the kind of officer I hope you'll become too. The story of the Royal Guard who was tossed by a SWAT officer had become much more than an account of a mistake and its aftermath. It had become a testament to the power of character, the importance of principle, and the possibility of transformation that exists when people choose to respond to conflict with wisdom, grace, and an unwavering commitment to doing what is right.